Welcome. Let's grab our Bibles. We're going to read from James chapter 5, verses 1 to 6 this morning. Continuing in our series on being family and what it means to be family as a church, and then looking at the character of family, where we've addressed a whole lot of themes and that sort of thing from the book of James: anger, perseverance, humility, and that sort of thing. And we're continuing in this series and looking this morning at wealth. And so here it is, James chapter 5, verse 1 to 6, where James writes the following. He says, "Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you." I should have told you before reading the passage to maybe put on a seatbelt, because this is James at, I think, his most strident best throughout the whole letter. I mean, over the past couple of weeks, as we've been looking at different passages, the issue of defaming and judging to condemn, or last week's presumptuous, boastful planning. I mean, this morning's passage makes those look like bedtime stories in comparison. It's almost as if James, something in him has just kind of flicked the switch and he's out of the blocks and he's now, listen, you rich people, just sort of really going for it, which makes us kind of take a step back and think, who's he talking to? Who's he got in mind here? Is he talking to Christians in the church? Maybe the businessmen from last week. Maybe they're not behaving as they ought to behave in church, and now James is kind of really having a go at them, as it were. But surely Christians wouldn't act like that, right? Surely Christians wouldn't behave like what we've just read in these 6 verses. The sad thing is, if you read a bit of church history, you'll discover that, well, Christians have behaved like that in the past. And then we kind of get to think, well, maybe he's not addressing Christians in the church. Maybe he's addressing people outside of the church, wealthy people outside the church that are taking advantage of humble Christians within the church by not paying them their wages and this sort of thing. And that leaves us scratching our heads, because we think, well, what would be the point in that? Because they're never going to go to church to hear the message. So how does that work exactly? It doesn't kind of make sense. And it kind of got me to thinking that maybe what James is doing in this passage is taking on the guise of an Old Testament prophet. Maybe he's actually addressing both groups. Maybe he's talking to the congregation in the church, and he's also talking to wealthy people outside of the church. And when you think of it like that, that seems to make sense. I can almost see the fire in James's eyes as he writes this. There's authority in his voice, and you can imagine the wind just kind of snatching at his long beard as he speaks. And the language fits. It fits with Old Testament prophetic language. Just go and read Isaiah chapter 5, sort of midway down, the woes and judgments, and you think, well, the kind of language that's being used is very similar. It makes sense because in the Old Testament writings, the people that were being denounced didn't necessarily have to be present. So throughout the Old Testament, you've got the prophets speaking to the people of God, but they're denouncing foreign nations and pronouncing judgment over foreign nations. Right? In order to understand this, we just need a good theology of words. Be reminded of Psalm 33, that the word of the Lord is faithful and true, that by the word of the Lord the heavens are made. Think about Isaiah 55, where the Lord says through the prophet, hey, my ways are not your ways, and my ways are far higher than your ways. And when I speak, my word goes forth, and it achieves the purpose for which I sent it. It doesn't return to me empty. And so as James is speaking, his word is going to be powerful and effective and achieve the purpose for which it was sent. And then it makes sense, because actually, if the congregation were listening to this, they would experience great comfort. They would be thinking to themselves, if they are the victims in this story, they'd be thinking to themselves, God sees us. God knows. God is speaking words of comfort to us. He hasn't forgotten us. He hasn't turned a blind eye towards the plight that we're experiencing. And then lastly, I'd say it makes sense because, in a sense, what James is doing is revealing the heart of God to the people as it relates to wealth. In a sense, he's kind of grabbing them and he's just sort of saying to them, hey, listen, keep a right perspective about money. Be very, very careful that the allure of wealth doesn't lead you away from chapter 4, verse 10. Do you remember what it is? Humble yourself under the Lord's hand, and he will lift you up. See, again, that's what is at the heart of the issue here again. Same as it was last week, same as it was the week before. The verses are all still flowing out of chapter 4, verse 10, where James says, humble yourself under the Lord's hand, and he will be the one to lift you up. So another question, do you remember the way to get there? Do you still remember the way of humility? I'm kind of tempted to do the actions for you that I told you about last week and that sort of thing. And you at home can just shout out the answers, or maybe we make a competition of it. You know, whoever's the first person to put the 5 steps in the chat, you'll get a batch of my famous scones. Only this time I'll make it with baking powder instead of bicarbonate of soda. You know, so you kind of set to setting out those steps over there. But hopefully you do remember, right? It begins with submitting to the Lord, bringing our lives under his banner, saying that we're on the Lord's side. He is our captain and our commander. Step 2, resisting the enemy, with the promise that he is going to flee. So we stand against the enemy and his lies and effects. Step 3, we draw closer to God through spiritual disciplines, spending time in prayer and in worship and in fellowship with other Christians, taking communion and so on. Step number 4, washing our hands, so that we're praying, God, purify my heart. God, I want to be holy as you're holy. It's a great little arrow prayer that you can pray at the moment. You're probably washing your hands now more than you ever have. You know, so every time you do, you just a little arrow prayer. God, I want to be holy like you. Would you help me to grow in holiness? And then number 5, lamenting over sin. All right, lamenting over sin because it grieves the heart of God. And it grieves the heart of God because he loves us and he knows that sin is no good for us. And each of these steps, we know, as we've said over the last 2 or 3 weeks, it takes us on a downward trajectory until we come to that place where we're under God's hand. Until we come to that place where we're waiting for him to be the one to lift us up. And in this place, we're not thinking less of ourselves, but we are thinking of ourselves less. And we're thinking about God more, and we're thinking about others more. And then in that place, our lives become this grand doorway that just swings open so that through our lives, people can glimpse the power and the glory and the beauty and the majesty of God. It's kind of like what Adrian was saying just now about being in the workplace. You know, not allowed to be able to speak, but living in such a way, behaving in such a way, responding in such a way that we enrich the people around us, that our lives become light in that place. And every time I think of this kind of illustration, I think, who doesn't want their life to be like that? Who wouldn't want their lives to be a doorway through which other people glimpse the power and the goodness and the glory of God? The only problem is that from this place of humility where we're under God's hand and we're enjoying joy and peace and hope in his presence, there's a whole lot of pathways that lead back up again. And James, what he's trying to do here is he's saying, in regards to wealth, there's 4 particular pathways. There's probably more, but James mentions 4. He says there's 4 particular pathways that will lead you. That it's going to try and tempt you. It's going to try and entice you. It's going to try and convince you to choose to take these pathways, slipping out from underneath God's hand and walking back up the hill, as it were. The only problem is every single one of them, as he mentions in verse 1, it leads to a place of weeping and wailing. And so his almost like prophetic-like voice thunders to the church in warning and in encouragement and in comfort, saying, listen, don't take these paths. If you're a child of God, then these paths are not for you. Path number one, don't be a hoarder. Right? Don't be a hoarder. The language that he uses in verse 2 to 3 is really important. He talks about wealth being corrupted, and he talks about moths eating the modern day equivalent, your jeans from Gucci or something like that, and the coins and the money and the gold and the silver that you have, it's all tarnished because it's just been sat in a cupboard with disuse. It's gone all kind of tarnished and blemished in color and that sort of thing, instead of being shiny because it's been passed around. And it reminds me of a phrase that I've heard Olive say many, many times. Apparently Horace used to say that money is not made flat to stack, but round to go around. And that's James's point here. He's saying, look, money is not made flat to stack, all right? It's made round so that it can go around. You mustn't hoard. The parable in Luke chapter 12 that Jesus tells kind of illustrates it perfectly. You may be familiar with it, but there's this farmer who gets a bumper crop one year, right? And he stacks his barn really full of the crop and discovers that actually only 20% has gone in. There's still another 80% that he needs to store somewhere. So he's standing, he's scratching his head. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? And I've got a great plan. I'm going to build bigger barns, and I'm going to fill those barns. And when those barns are filled, then I'm just going to kick back. I'm going to relax. Life is going to be easy. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. I am going to be sorted. And if we drag last week's message into this week, then we can see this guy, well, he's not taking into account that God is in control. He's not taking into account that he doesn't know what tomorrow will bring. And he's not taking into account the fact that his life is actually just a vapor. And Jesus looks at him and he says, you're a fool. You're a fool because you've ignored what the surplus abundant wealth is there for. The clue is in chapter 12, verse 33, where Jesus says that we should sell possessions and give to the poor. And in this way, we'll be storing up treasures in heaven, and we'll be building a purse that will not wear away. And so the man's a fool, because what he should have done was stored up the 20% in his barn and then taken the 80% and perhaps sold that at the market and given the money to the poor. And given it to Project 58.7 or other such things like this. Jesus looks at him and says, you're a fool, because the actions that you display of storing up all of this wealth points to the fact that you don't trust me to be your provider. And you've got it all figured out. What do you need my help for? And Jesus looks at him and says, look, you're a fool, because the way that you're living, your actions are saying, I don't really believe that there is judgment and there is life after death. I'm just going to live for this moment. I'm just going to eat, drink, and be merry and not worry about anything else. And Jesus says, to live like that, to think that this life is all that there is, it is absolute foolishness. Money is not made flat to stack. It's round so that it can go around. Don't be a hoarder. Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking at this stage. You're thinking, well, if that's the case, am I allowed to save? At what point should Christians save? Is it okay for Christians to save? And the answer is yes, it's okay for Christians to save. Yes, you need to save. But we need to be aware of this real, I go so far as to say the Christians that don't save are probably foolish as well, all right? So, but there's this real tension in between these things. So on the one hand, we're people who are waiting for the Lord to come, and we know that he can come at any moment. But at the same time, we also know that he may be long in his coming, because a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. And so we need to kind of walk this balance between these two things, and we need to prepare, but we also need to be open-handed. So you're probably thinking, well, how do I do that? How do I walk the tightrope between kind of saving wisely and without tipping over into being a hoarder? It's quite simple, really. You just need to ask yourself two questions. First question is this: does the level of my saving still reflect my trust in God? Does the level of my savings still reflect my trust in God? In other words, is there space for me to still be trusting God to provide for me? Question number 2, am I prepared to live before the Lord like this, with the wealth that He has given me in my hands, open-handedly, saying, God, whatever you want, it's yours? 2 simple questions, quite difficult to answer. Even more so when you realize that when you do answer them, if you say, yes, my savings do reflect my trust in the Lord, and yes, I am living with open hands, then you can be absolutely sure the Lord is going to test that. I can think of at least 2 occasions in recent years where Adele and I have been saving for things. We were kind of wisely saving for things. So we had made some plans, godly plans, and we were putting sort of money away. And the Lord came alongside us and said, well, there's this that's going on, and there's this person that's in need. And I was kind of thinking maybe I could have that you're saving up for to give to these people now. And how we answer this reveals whether or not we're hoarding or whether we're exercising wise, godly saving. When we say to the Lord, yeah, of course you can have it because it's yours in the first place. Yeah, you can take it because I trust you. I know that those plans are still in place, and later on down the line, you will provide for me. So yeah, of course you can have it. It's all yours anyway. And maybe you'll change the plan, so I won't need it. So, but whatever it is, it's yours. And if our response is that, then we'll probably walk in the right line. But if our response is to kind of hold on to it and to say, do you mind checking with everybody else first? I've got a cap, you can take it. Just go around. I know of at least 40 people in the church that are far better. They drive better cars than me. They live in better houses. I think they're better off than me. If you just kind of whip around with them first, you're going to ask them. And if you get to the end and we're still not at the total that we need, then come back and speak to me. But I've probably got another 10 that I could point you to first before you come back to me. If that's your response, then you know that, hey, listen, I'm probably not saving wisely. I'm not living open-handedly before God. I'm hoarding. And James is prophetically saying, hey, listen, don't do that, because it leads to a path of weeping and wailing. Warning number 2, don't be dishonest in your dealings with wealth. It's in verse 4. Right here, the illustration is of an employer who is withholding the wages from his workers, and that's terrible. That is terrible in that particular. I mean, it's bad enough in this context. But it's terrible in that context, because the people would have been paid every night. So as they finished the day's work, they would gather, they would get their wages, then they'd go to the market, they'd buy bread, and they'd go home and they'd feed their families. There wasn't grocery cupboards with a month's worth of groceries, all right, that they could fall back on in case the wages didn't come through. They were literally, in this culture, so many of the population were living hand to mouth. So if an employer held back the wages, man, that was a terrible thing to do. And there's plenty of modern day equivalents, right? It's not just happening in that example. There's plenty of modern day equivalents to being dishonest in our dealings with money. And this is where the warning goes to those who are rich and those who perhaps think that they're not rich. And the warning to landlords who withhold their tenant's deposit at the end of a tenancy. Employers who don't pay their employees overtime or time off in lieu. Employees who take sick days, but they're not sick, they just want to go to the beach. Or employees who add on an extra couple of hours onto their time shift sheet at the end of each week because they think that the boss should be paying them more, but he's not paying them more, so they're going to claim more hours so that they do get paid more. But it's totally justified because I'm worth it, right? Filling out a self-assessment. How easy is it that in those moments to kind of say, well, I'll just kind of adjust things slightly so that I can come out a little bit better at the end of it. And James is saying that don't be dishonest like this. And he's warning, I love it, it goes in 2 directions. Right? First of all, it goes towards the rich that are victimizing those who are working in their fields, and it's saying to them, listen, God sees you. When you're dishonest in your dealings with wealth, it's not that nobody sees, God sees. And there is a day of judgment, and you will be called to account. And you're going to have to own up. It's going to be put out all before you. So be careful, James is saying to those who are rich. But at the same time, his word goes to the poor, and it's a word of comfort to them. He's saying to them, listen, God hears you. You've gone at the end of the day and you're banging on the door of the farmer, and he's saying, you can keep knocking, but you can't come in, and I'm not going to pay you today, so you might as well just go away. As you cry out at that door and he doesn't listen, your cry is coming up to a higher court of appeals, where the Almighty God, who is lawgiver and judge, does hear your prayer. And he will act on your behalf. And he is a good provider. And he will not leave us nor forsake us. And this truth should bring us immense comfort. If you ever find yourself in this place where you're the victim of other people's dishonest dealings in terms of wealth, this truth that God hears you should bring you immense comfort. It means you don't need to get wound up. It means you don't need to get angry and bitter or harbor unforgiveness or anything like it. You can say with great trust, I trust you, faithful lawgiver and judge. When the time is right, you will deal with this. It releases us. It's the same principle that when we think about forgiveness, we can forgive other people because the sins that they have been committed against us have been laid upon Jesus. And ultimately, people will have to give an account for what they have done. Nothing gets swept underneath the carpet. Everything gets dealt with. And so we can just leave it at the foot of the cross. We can trust the one who is faithful to provide for us. Warning 2, don't be dishonest in your dealings with wealth. Number 3, don't beware of living in luxury and self-indulgence. So don't live in luxury and self-indulgence. And I think that the kind of leaning of the language here is where James is going with this. He's talking about pleasures and provision that have moved over into vice. Okay, so there's no practice of self-restraint. There's no practice of self-denial. There's no practice of simple living, to the extent that anybody who is in need is absolutely ignored. That's the idea that James is kind of pushing at here. A great example is back in Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, the rich man and Lazarus. You know the story? He's all dressed up, the rich man, in his fine purple linen, and he's got this big swanky house with all the mods and cons. He's eating a feast every day, and he's just so consumed with himself and his self-indulgent luxury and that sort of thing that he doesn't even see Lazarus at the gate. And the dogs see Lazarus. And they come to Lazarus and they lick his sores. But the rich man doesn't even bat an eyelid in his direction. And I love the metaphor that James uses here. He says, listen, you have fattened yourself in the day of slaughter. Right? So the imagery that he's bringing to mind here is 2 cows in a field. And I want to ask you the question, what kind of cow are you? All right. So there's 2 cows in a field, and the one cow is self-indulgent and after all the luxurious grass, and this cow is just like a lawnmower, backwards, forwards, eating all the grass. And as she goes, she nudges the other cow out of the way so that cow has to go stand underneath a tree and eat the tiny little dry bits of grass. And with every day, the self-indulgent cow gets fatter and the other one gets thinner. But with every passing day, as this one's getting fatter and that one's getting thinner, market day is coming. And the butcher is coming. I want to say the baker and the candlestick maker as well, but just think about the butcher, okay, is coming with the abattoir. And on market day, when it comes, and the butcher goes out to stand next to his field and he looks out at the field, which cow is he going to be taking? I mean, he's not going to take the skinny one, relegated to the space under the tree. He's going to look at the fat one. He's going to say, brilliant, come on. It's time for the day of slaughter. And James's whole point here is, listen, he's saying, listen, don't be self-indulgent, because there's a day of judgment that will come. and you're going to have to give an account. Warning number 4, my little paraphrase, it's in verse 6, but my paraphrase would be, don't chase after money. We read about this in Matthew's gospel, don't we? Don't chase after mammon. You can't serve 2 masters. Right? James is saying here, listen, don't chase after money. The NIV translates it by saying, you have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. It kind of puts the translation in the plural, but the NSRV, which I think is probably in this case is holding closer to the original, has it this way and says, you have condemned and murdered the righteous one who did not resist you. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who did not resist you. Is anybody coming to mind? Perhaps Jesus? Perhaps Judas, who betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver because he was so consumed with this love of money, for money, pointed out by some of the other gospel writers that he used to help himself to money from the purse, getting really indignant, probably front and center when Mary anointed Jesus with the expensive perfume. He was probably front and center saying, man, that money should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Actually thinking I should have been the one to go and sell it and line my pockets, maybe. But then he takes the bribe of 30 pieces of silver and he betrays his friend. And Jesus is condemned and murdered, the righteous one. And for his part, Jesus just bows to the act. The verse, in a way, it's just sort of saying to us that the sinfulness of those that love money will always plot a pathway of suffering for others. If we make money our number one goal, it's always going to affect the other people around us. As I got down to verse 6 in what has been a really kind of heavy passage, hasn't it? I began to think that maybe here in this verse is the first glimmer of hope in a passage that has just been filled with very strident, very strong, very full-on warning and judgment. Maybe this is the verse that kind of chimes the note of grace, if you want to think of it like that. Because when you follow the story on, Judas betrays Jesus. Jesus is condemned to die on a cross. And he speaks words from the cross which say, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Today you'll be with me in paradise. It is finished. Into your hands I commend my spirit. Words from the cross, from the Son of God, who humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And in doing so, made a way for us to be reconciled to the Father through his blood shed on the cross. Made a way for us to be set free from the love of money so that we can live underneath the hand of God in a place of humility, trusting, not thinking less of ourselves, but just thinking of ourselves less. Thinking of God more and others more, living open-handedly before the Lord God Almighty. Just this, the whole picture is just, it just screams of the gospel. Because you have the righteous one who is not shown mercy dying, so that us, the unrighteous ones, may live and be shown mercy. And so as a result, our lives can be changed. I mean, in a sense, this verse just captures Habakkuk's prayer, God in wrath, remember mercy. And here you see it in verse 6 of James's passage. It's just that this is God in wrath, remembering mercy. 4 pathways that can lead us away from a place of humility given to us by James with a very stark warning. And let me bring this to a close by just saying 1 or 2 things before I talk about character very, very briefly. I just want to say, you may be thinking after hearing James's strong warning, Is it okay to be rich? Yeah, it's okay to be rich. There's plenty of examples in the Bible that talk about Abraham and his wealth, Job and his wealth, Joseph of Arimathea. There's plenty of wealthy people in the Bible that are not condemned. But I think what James is saying here is beware that the devil prowls like a lion waiting to devour us. And so often attached to health. This is why I think that the bulk of the message of the Bible drives Christians towards simple living, right? Because the temptation around wealth is so big, right? The way that we make wealth, we can be tempted to do that in a way which is dishonest. The way that we use wealth, we can be tempted in a way to use that which is dishonest, that fine line between saving and hoarding. Living in self-indulgent luxury rather than living simply. I guess in this way, Paul was right when he said that the money is a root of all evil. It can trap us into many foolish and harmful desires that will plunge men and women into ruin and destruction. The enemy will always be there, tempting us to use wealth in a way which would dishonor God. But thankfully, that's not the end of the story. Thankfully, we're invited through the gospel to live a life of character, living in such a way, doing what is right as God defines what is right, regardless of the cost to us. And so in closing, if we're kind of thinking about this, let's just think about how we can grow in character in terms of how we use our wealth and the wealth that God has bestowed upon us, entrusted to us to steward wisely for Him. 3 things, you're familiar with these: identity, desire, and habit. Right? We know that whether these 3 things converge, that is the place, the crucible, where character begins to grow. So number 1, identity. You become who you are. Right? And let me remind you, you are a child of God who has been gloriously saved, lavishly blessed with every spiritual blessing. God has poured out the abundance of the kingdom upon you. You are rich beyond measure. And that truth of knowing who you are conditions you, enables you to say, I can live like this with my hands held open to God because I'm weighed down by the blessing of God. All right? That's who you are, blessed by God. You've got reason to be thankful from now until eternity. All right, so we can be generous because God has blessed us extravagantly. Why can't we be extravagant with our giving and our generosity if God has blessed us so extravagantly? All right, identity, desire. You become what you love. And if your love is for money, then I can tell you where that path will lead. It will lead to luxury and self-indulgence and greed and ultimately sin. And actually, there won't be much joy, the kind of kingdom joy and stuff attached to that path. But if we make Jesus our whole desire, if we seek His kingdom first above all things, it comes with a promise that all other things will be added to us. It's glorious promise. And so we're asked again, who do we want to be like? Are we going to be like Judas? Betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver? So in other words, seeking wealth first? Or are we going to be like the woman in the Gospels who come to Jesus with the most extravagant, precious gift of oil or nard or perfume, and they just pour it out upon Jesus? And there's just incredible picture of worship. Worshipping Jesus with their whole lives and their wallets as well. Which one are we going to be? Where's our desire going to come? If we make Jesus our one desire, that'll lead to generous, open-handed living. Humble living under the hand of God. Number 3, habit. You become what you do. So just practice generosity, whether you like it or not. Right? Especially if you don't like it. This is the way through this. I think the only way to make sure that money doesn't have a hold on us is for us to open our hands so that we're not holding on to it. And allow God to take and use and always be putting Him first.